I have with me David Barton, and David is the founder of Wall Builders. He is an author of several books on American history and the Constitution. He has a new addition to the book, The Jefferson Lies, exposing the myth you've always believed about Thomas Jefferson. So when James told me, my producer told me we had David coming on, I could not believe it. David, it's an honor to have you on. We're Skyping with David right now. Can you turn your radio off for me? We're getting a feedback. Do you have a radio on, David?
No, sir. No radio on here.
Oh, okay. We're getting a feedback from somewhere. We'll take care of that. It's an
Yeah.
honor to have you on, David, and finally meet you. I've never met you, right?
I don't think so. I don't think we've met before, but it's an honor to be on your show. Thanks for having me, bro.
Yes, sir. A lot of people know about you. Tell us about the Wall Builders. Why did you start or found it, the Wall Builders?
You know, Wall Builders is a name we take from the Bible book of Nehemiah, and it literally is the largest grassroots story in the Bible. It's people who looked around and said, you know, we're not what we used to be. We need to rebuild. And so Nehemiah led them to rebuild their country. We like that image of people getting involved at the local level. There was no big names there to speak of. It was just people doing it all around them. And when everybody took care of their place on the wall, the whole country was rebuilt. So we like that. And a lot of what we do is, as they rebuilt the wall there in the Bible, they rebuilt what was called the Hall of Heroes. That was one of the places they rebuilt. And it's because the Scripture is so big into knowing our history. Time after time, God says, recall the former days, remember the former times. So that was a big part of it, and you'll find that every revival in the Bible stemmed around history. As with Josiah, when Josiah was trying to rebuild the nation, he found that scroll in the temple, and it led to a national revival. So what we do, and you know, for anybody that sees it on Skype, they see this big flag behind me.
Yeah.
We're sitting in a museum, and behind us is the World War II section of that museum. That's a D-Day flag over my shoulder, the third ship in the D-Day. But we are loaded up with about 100,000 documents from before 1812. So I have thousands of the writings of George Washington and John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, all these guys. And it really is like rediscovering history, because the way we teach history now is so far off from what actually happened that it's kind of like, as it was in Nehemiah, rebuilding the Hall of Heroes and going back through Josiah, kind of rediscovering that scroll and finding out who we used to be.
Why is it so important that we, the people, need to know this? How would it help us?
Well, you know, a lot of the ways it helps us is that God, while people may think of evolution in whatever sense they think of it, one thing is for sure is that mankind's principles don't change over time.
Yeah.
And so we hear today that, oh man, those guys who wrote our Constitution, they rode horses. They didn't know what internet was. They surely can't help us today. But in my case, I happen to be a pilot. And I'm a pilot because over 400 years ago, Newton came up with the laws of motion, particularly the second law of motion. That's why I can fly. I scuba dive. We do that because over 400 years ago, Robert Boyle came up with Boyle's law of gases, which allows me to do it. There's so many things we do that are based on really old principles. And that was the cool thing about the founding of our country, our Constitution. It doesn't talk about specifics like internet or horses. It talks about principles of mankind, and those principles do not change over time. That's why the Scripture tells us in Ecclesiastes 1:9, there's nothing new under the sun.
Yeah.
200 years ago, the Founding Fathers dealt with abortion. They dealt with marriage laws. They dealt with homosexuality in the military. They dealt with whether the federal government should bail out private businesses too big to fail. I mean, everything we're going through now, they've already dealt with, and so we can learn from history if we're willing to do so.
That's amazing. Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. How key was he to our values?
Say that again, Jesse.
Thomas,
how was he on what?
How important was he to our values?
Yeah. Well, it was really important for where we are today, because in the Declaration of Independence, right up front, they start with 155 words that give us the 6 principles of American government. And everything in the Constitution goes to one of those 6 principles. So he laid out the principles of government, and we are now the longest ongoing constitutional republic in the history of the world. We're one of the youngest nations, but we have one of the oldest governments. We've been under the same piece of paper now for 238 years. You look at Brazil, they've had 21 constitutions that time. Venezuela's had 25. Haiti's had, Thailand's had 17. Poland's had 7 constitutions since 1919. I mean, it's amazing what we have. So the principles are there, and he laid them out. They're really important. But the first 3 principles all stem around God. Number 1, there is a creator. Number 2, the creator gave us a certain set of rights. And number 3, government exists to protect God-given rights. So those are the first 3 principles of government that are laid out. And then when he did his first inaugural address as president, he said that if we ever want to be a happy and a prosperous people, he said it begins by acknowledging and adoring an overruling providence. So
Amazing.
God's a big part of what he laid out that we no longer pay attention to today.
David, how can people get the book? Congratulations, by the way. How can people get it?
Easiest way to get it is to go to Amazon.com. It's all over the nation, but Amazon is the easy way.
Oh, okay. Black people have been told by other black liberals that Jefferson raped a black woman and had a baby by her. Is that true?
That is not true. That story came out in November of 1998, and that was part of what was called Nature and Science magazine. They said, oh, we've done DNA testing. DNA testing now proves that Jefferson fathered children through his slave Sally Hemings. So now we know it. And that story ran in 221 papers initially. 6 weeks later, the story was pulled down because the DNA did not test that. Among other things, they never even used Thomas Jefferson's DNA. So it's a little hard to prove that he did it when they didn't use his DNA. That was part of the reason the story was pulled. We talked to the DNA researcher who did it, Eugene Foster. He said, look, I told him that it didn't say that, but the guy who wrote the story, Joseph Ellis, at that time, Clinton was being impeached, and he thought this would really help Clinton. You know, we can say, oh, Jefferson had an affair and nothing happened to him, so why should it happen to Clinton? So he took off on his own direction, well beyond what anything the research had showed. And so nobody ever heard that the story got pulled back. It only ran in 11 newspapers when they pulled the story back because it already made the big splash. So to this day, people still think, oh, Jefferson did it. Well, that's not what the DNA shows. So that's the short end of that story, Jesse.
That is amazing. It's amazing how many lies we have been told in order to keep us angry, to manipulate, and to control us. It's mind-blowing.
Yeah, and you know, along that same line of race right now, the Democrat Party, they consider Jefferson their founder. That's what they had on their website. Thomas Jefferson founded the party. Their dinners are called Jefferson-Jackson dinners. And this year they've started saying, oh, we got to get rid of Thomas Jefferson. He was a racist bigot. And that's an interesting thing because all previous generations knew that was not true, especially black folk. And it's interesting, for those that see Skype, I've got a book here in my hand. This is the first black man to ever speak in front of the U.S. Congress. It's a sermon that he gave, and this is the week that they abolished slavery. And in this sermon, he praises Thomas. He's a black man. He was in slavery. He praises Thomas Jefferson because Jefferson worked so hard to end slavery. Jefferson had slaves, but his own state laws would not allow him to end slavery. So here you have a black civil rights leader praising Jefferson. This book is Frederick Douglass's own writings. Frederick Douglass, great civil rights leader, praised Jefferson for all he did to end slavery. Here's a white abolitionist, John Quincy Adams, who praised Jefferson for all he did to end slavery. So when you look back across history, how come all the civil rights leaders, both black and white, praised Jefferson for trying to end slavery? And what we never get told is that Jefferson did own slaves. He was given them even as a young boy of 13. And in Virginia law, when you inherit slaves, you're not allowed to free them. Plus, he was, as he said, by state law, not allowed to free his slaves for other reasons. He was in debt. You're not allowed to free slaves. But one of the very first laws he introduced as a legislator was to free all slaves in Virginia. He got shouted down and beat up over it. When he got into the U.S. Congress, he introduced a law to free slaves nationally, all over the nation. He lost it by one vote, and he wrote in his diary, oh, that God would have changed one heart. You know, we were one vote short. What would have happened if we'd had one more? And then he worked across the world to end slavery. So here's a great civil rights leader who busted his tail to end slavery and bring equality. And today we consider him a racist bigot. And yet that's not what he was in previous generations. So that's another one of those Jefferson lies that we've been taught wrong about today.
What year did that black man, the first black man spoke in Congress, what year was that?
That was 1865. It's really interesting. He was He had been in slavery, and he escaped to slavery. He became a pastor of 15th Street Presbyterian Church, or 15th Street Presbyterian Church. And on the day that they abolished slavery in the House, they'd done it in the Senate, but on February of 1865, they abolished slavery in the House. And so on that day, they asked this former slave, Henry Highland Garnett, to come preach a sermon on that Sunday. And so that Sunday, there were several thousand there. He preached a 2-hour sermon. That's what I just showed you is his sermon.
Right.
But it's interesting, they had church in the Capitol because back in December of 1800, Thomas Jefferson helped form that church in the Capitol. And by 1854, the largest church in the United States was a church that met every single Sunday in the U.S. Capitol. That's where senators went, and representatives went, and presidents went, etc. Jefferson went there his 8 years as president. And that's another thing. We're told Jefferson was a secularist who wanted a separation of church and state. Now, his separation of church and state was keep the government from stopping religious activities. And so as you look at him, he started church services in the Capitol. He helped start church services in the War Department and the Treasury Department. I mean, in Washington, D.C., if you wanted to go to church on Sunday, you go to government buildings, and that's Jefferson.
That is amazing. We're running out of time, but I want to ask, people say that Jefferson tore out pages of the Bible. Is that true?
It is not true. We actually, I have here showing you one of the two. They're called the Jefferson Bible. Here's one of the originals. There's another one. And what he did was he read a sermon that said, if you want to evangelize the Indians, don't give them the full Bible because they might read the genealogies or they might read Leviticus, or start with something easy. Start with the teachings of Jesus. So he went through the Bible. He went through the New Testament, cut out the teachings of Jesus, pasted them end to end, what we would call a red letter edition. It included miracles. Jesus was raising the dead, healing the sick, casting out demons. We're told he did a Bible where he cut out all the miraculous, supernatural nonsense. Anyone who reads that will see the miraculous throughout it. It was just, as he said, it's an abridgment of the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John for the use of the Indians at their level of comprehension. So he just made an abridgment of the Gospels showing Jesus' teachings and life and presented that to the Indians. And now critics today said, oh, he cut out all the theological stuff. That's nonsense. Again, all that supernatural stuff, you'll find it throughout what he did. So that's another one of those Jefferson lies we've been taught today.
How can people get all those books you just mentioned?
The cool thing is we have a lot of them online. We have that library with 100,000 works, so we put a lot of these up online. But now there are so many other sources that are coming up online with the original documents that you can see for yourself. At wallbuilders.com, we have what we call helpful links, and we have a section of just historical links where you can link over and see the actual original documents. And the original documents, the cool thing about them is they don't have a political agenda. They just speak for themselves. And we've been subject to political agendas for the last 25, 30 years, and that's why getting back to original documents is so cool.
I have 1 minute or two, maybe two, but 1 minute left, David. What has this done for you to know all this? How has this helped you in your life?
Well, it's helped me a whole lot because I went through school and I was taught a lot of things about history. And several years ago, I came across 2 actual original historical documents. And when I read them, they were totally different than what I've been taught about in school. And I'm going, whoa, now wait a minute. And I got to believe either the originals or what I was taught. And so I started looking for other originals. We found them, and that's where the collection started. So it has totally turned my knowledge on its head because so much of what I was taught just wasn't so. And so going back to the originals, that's why I like Acts 17:11. Paul said the people he loved the most were those who didn't believe him. They checked the Bible every day to see if he was telling them the truth. And that's what we've started doing with history is go back to the originals. You get a whole different story.
And that's wallbuilders.com, you say?
Wallbuilders.com and Amazon.com for the book.
David, I'm going to have you back. I could go on and on and on and on with you. God bless you, man. You're something else.
Thanks, Jesse. Thanks for all you do, brother. Bless you, man.
Thank you. You too, David. I appreciate it. God bless you.
Our pleasure.
Okay.